This story takes place on a faraway planet called Prismos. It's a planet where the citizens live a prosperous, advanced lifestyle, having become used to an existence of comfort and ease for thousands of years. That is, of course, until the three blazing suns of Prismos realign, causing a failure of all technology and setting the planet back to a simpler, more medieval time. Magic becomes the new desired commodity, and the struggle over such powers causes the eventual conflict between good and evil, namely the ongoing battles between the heroic Spectral Knights, led by Leoric, and the villainous Darkling Lords, led by Darkstorm. It's a tale that's told through a 13-episode cartoon, as well as a handful of comics, and of course, a single wave of toys that quite literally exemplify the pure magic of 1980s nostalgia. Perhaps the line had more potential and could have lasted longer, and maybe it got lost in the shuffle of all the toy properties that existed simultaneously during this era. Or possibly, it came out at a less than optimal time and wasn't quite what children were looking for in 1987 when the Visionaries made their debut. Either way, it's a part of toy history that's worth revisiting. With that, let's head over to the planet of Prismos and back to a time when magic was more powerful than science. So stay tuned, because this is the history of the Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light. Let's begin.
So 1987 was probably peak what I call the dark times, where there was the big three, the He-Man, the Transformers, the G.I. Joes. They were huge in the early 80s. He-Man had the good graces to kind of bow out a little early. Transformers and G.I. Joe just kept on trucking through to the 90s. But that was right before the Turtles kicked off. They had a cartoon in, I want to say 87, and then the toys really hit the market in 88. So it's a very short amount of time between the big three and Turtles. However, when you consider children's perception of time, it's extreme. Like, every month is a year. Like, it's almost like dog years kind of acceleration, where you felt this void of the big ticket thing. So around 1987, I would say, real Ghostbusters, maybe Mask, maybe Gem and the Holograms, Thundercats, like they sort of filled that void they found in market, but everyone else was just throwing like spaghetti at the wall. So you had your Hasbros, your Mattels, they're sending out Brave Stars, they're sending out Visionaries, they're sending out Centurions, and all of them were competing with each other, but also like even within companies. I mean, they would throw out a toy line. If it made $1 billion, great. If it didn't, cancel it. And you got 5 more in the wing. So it was a lot of experimentation. It was chaos. It was absolute chaos.
And coming out of that experimentation and chaos, the Visionaries had found their key featured gimmick that was hopefully going to propel them to the same success levels as the brands from earlier in the decade, and that was the use of holograms on the toys, which were meant to depict the magical powers you were seeing in the cartoon.
By 1987, holograms they're all the rage. It was, this was new technology at the time. And likewise, Supernaturals was doing very much the same thing.
Indeed, the Supernaturals lineup of toys by Tonka would introduce holograms simultaneously with Visionaries in 1987, thus creating some stiff competition on that front. But Hasbro had gone head-to-head with Tonka before with similar toy lines, namely when the Transformers went up against and eventually outsold Tonka's GoBots just a few years prior, so this level of competition was nothing new to Hasbro. Unfortunately though, and as history would show, neither the Visionaries nor Supernaturals would hit the blockbuster levels of success that each company had hoped for. As for the story of the Visionaries, the 1987 cartoon would play out with the wizard Merklin summoning many knights and warriors across Prismos to participate in challenges, to see who could survive till the end and receive the ability to control magical powers. Eventually, a total of 14 individuals would emerge victorious, each receiving an animal or creature totem to solidify their magical abilities. 8 of these individuals would each receive a magical staff containing further powers, and 4 individuals would eventually realize that they could power and operate vehicles in an age where this level of technology no longer exists. And 2 characters, well, aside from getting magical totems, they didn't receive magic staffs nor found themselves designated to a vehicle. We'll get to that point soon. The heroic Spectral Knights would find themselves against the evil Darkling Lords, and the rivalry would play itself out over the life of the cartoon, the comic, and the toy line. The comic's first issue by Star Comics, which is an imprint of Marvel Comics, follows the same story as the cartoon initially, though it would take a diversion path thereafter. As for the wizard Merklin, who gave the characters their powers and often controlled how much they would get, well, unlike other elderly, wise, sage-like beings of the Saturday morning cartoon era, he was a lot more self-serving and was certainly not your typical friendly mentor, keeping something of a neutral allegiance while sending our heroes and villains on quests largely for his own benefit.
Do you think I give you magic out of selflessness? Of course not.
He's an old bastard, isn't he?
I do it because I want you to be instruments of my will.
He was unique for Saturday mornings. He was very much, the trickster god. And he also sort of made things complicated for heroes and villains. We were very much used to good guys, bad guys. But because they were reliant on him to regenerate their power, he made them do just random missions for him, and they were up against other magicians who likewise had beef with Merklin. There's a lot of murkiness over who the good guy and the bad guy is. Maybe a little bit ahead of its time in that regard.
As for the characters themselves, we may as well dive into the toy line that had so much potential but sadly only released this single wave of toys. That of course does not deter from the fun collectability factor decades later, as this collection will show. We may as well start with Leoric. The noble leader of the Spectral Knights, his animal totem was that of the lion, and he carried a staff containing the Owl of Wisdom. He'd be the most prominent character of the line, and because every series in this era needed a slogan, he was the one who would lead his fellow knights in the classic series catchphrase.
May the light shine forever!
May the light shine forever.
Leoric would be flanked by other heroes such as the team speedster known as Witterquick. Witterquick's totem was that of the cheetah, which is a natural fast-running animal, and he carried a power staff containing the ability to let him travel at light speed. Cryotech was a few years older than the other Spectral Knights, but nonetheless, he was considered the muscle of the team. Naturally, his animal totem was that of the bear, and he can call forth a magical archer when using his power staff. Here's Arzon, who provided aerial combat abilities for the heroes with his totem of the eagle, and he could also call forth the power of knowledge that was contained within his power staff. And while that takes care of the 4 staff-wielding heroes, the Spectral Knights also had 2 vehicles. Here's Ektar, a former police officer on Prismos, and he would bear the totem of the fox. He was the driver of the Lancer cycle, which had a single-seat cockpit and had a cool battering ram feature. It was the smaller of the 2 Visionaries vehicles that the Spectral Knights had. You've got Farrell over here, who's a young knight that bore the totem of the wolf, and he was packed in with the larger Spectral Knights vehicle known as the Capture Chariot. This was a neat vehicle in that it could hold other knights within the pods it came with on the vehicle's back, and these pods were detachable and could be seen flying around in the cartoon. As with other vehicles in the line, you could put the staffs into various inserts behind the pods, and you'll note that it has a few holograms of its own, which of course is a feature that's common to all the vehicles and figures of this range. The final member of the heroic side would be the female Galadria. Granted, with the totem of the dolphin, she was given neither a power staff nor a vehicle, nor did she have a toy in this range. That said, she did have something of a romantic relationship with Cryotech in the cartoon. As with Viralina, who was the evil female of the series, Hasbro didn't seem to want to produce female characters, even if Viralina and Galadria made for natural enemies in the cartoon, and such battles could have continued to take place in your living room if you had only had the option to buy the toys.
Those 2 kind of speak to the sort of like the make and the build of the toy line itself, where each character had, in theory, their own rival. So some were very obvious. You had like 2 leaders, you had 2 kind of dumb strong guys, you had Ektar and Recon were kind of a cop and robber, so With the ladies, likewise, at least they sort of had that like kind of baked in, fish girls kind of rivalry. So I think that was part of the problem that they weren't made, is that you would have had to do 2 in 1 wave. And by 1987, Hasbro was never going to do that. By this point, they were, they sort of gave up. Because again, too, like, unless you made a lot of money, they weren't interested.
And that's a great point. With Hasbro's marketing here being primarily driven towards the young male demographic, they would at times release a sole female character in an opening wave, like they did with Scarlet for the 1982 G.I. Joe A Real American Hero debut, with a few other females released sporadically throughout the lifespan of the brand, but it wasn't always going to be the case. Lines such as Cops never released any of their female characters, and Hasbro planned but never officially released RC for the Transformers, even by the 3rd wave when she would have made sense storyline-wise, all despite the success of the Transformers line. Now moving over to the villains, Darkstorm was the leader of the Darkling Lords and himself was a natural foil to the good-natured Leoric. Darkstorm's totem was that of a swamp mollusk, and he had the magical power of decay contained within his staff, which is an ability he would use during the show to sometimes age a person to be close to death. Sindar was the strongman amongst the Darkling Lords, being a bit of a foil to Cryotech. His totem was that of a gorilla, and his staff contained the power of destruction. That said, Sindar did have a bit of a softer side on the show, particularly when he would display an affinity for innocent animals. Kryvak had the totem of the Phylot, which resembles a pterodactyl, and he had the power of fear contained within his staff. He was voiced by the famous Chris Latta, and while Latta voiced other characters in the show, his voice work for Kryvak was the same as the voice he had used for Cobra Commander in G.I. Joe, as well as Starscream in the Transformers.
Talk does not further our cause. Let's move from this agony.
Lexor was the other member of the Darkling Lords who came with a staff. His totem was that of the Armadillo, and he had the power of invulnerability that he could summon when he used his magical staff. Mortrid was the somewhat annoying, cringingly loyal follower to Darkstorm and had the totem of the Beetle. He came with the smaller of the 2 Darkling Lords vehicles, which was namely the Skyclaw. Recon over here was a former thief on Prismos, so naturally he had the totem of the Lizard. His vehicle was the very large Dagger Assault, and this would be the holy grail amongst Visionaries toys, and was the most sizable in the range. In fact, have a look at it parked in front of the 1987 G.I. Joe Mobile Command Center, which itself is a behemoth of a toy. This thing was quite feature heavy in that it had a battering ram in the front that was operated by a mechanism in the back, and it had a chamber where you could kidnap a Spectral Knight and steal his powers, just like in the cartoon. It also had working catapults, a smaller vehicle that could be separated from the rest of the Dagger Assault, and of course, could hold several other Darkling Lords when Recon would ride off with it into combat. It's not an item that you can find often in the collector's market, and if it isn't already obvious, many collectors consider this to be the most desirable piece in the entire Visionaries toy range. Virulina rounds out the ranks of the villains and was given the totem of the shark. And while the animated series didn't give either female character much beyond this totem, what with the lack of a power staff or a vehicle, their further capabilities would be realized beyond the cartoon episodes.
And I mean, you saw that potential elsewhere. So in the cartoon, they had, good moments in the cartoon. However, everyone had specific powers beyond just their little totem animal thing. So the comic book sort of picked up the slack and sort of said, like, look, they've got shields. That if they had toys, the shields would have holograms on them. And Virulina, of course, was disease, per her name, and Galadriel was healing, and that sort of gave them just a little bit extra oomph to them. So I mean, had they made toys, had they, done that would have been my headcanon.
Of course, as with most toys, there was a level of imaginative play expected of children, but the Visionaries with their holograms were intended to take this one step further, though opinions on how well that worked would differ from one child to the next. What's meant by that is that the characters in the cartoon could each turn into their respective animal totems, but the toys could not.
It was something we should have gotten in the toy. It would have been, kind of handy to have a little blue lion or a green pterodactyl come with your figure, in the sense that, again, like, the holograms were supposed to invoke the powers of these people, but the hologram, expensive as it was the big deal. So cool gimmick, but in practicality, like within the canon of the show, when we had to actually like look at, now my figure turns into a bird, and you're like, well, it doesn't. You just have a hologram. So again, there's a bit of a disconnect between the toy and the cartoon, but we loved holograms. We were suckers for it, so it worked.
And on the subject of the cartoon, it has aged quite well and was definitely a bit darker compared to other animated series of the same era. Not to mention, it also had a pretty neat theme song.
I just love that it was like heavy shadow, it was darker, and I liked by this point we were getting into less, He-Man moral lessons, episodic, and a little more serialized. You would see that with like Teddy Ruxpin, or later on with Pirates of Darkwater, where there was a larger story. If you want a good watch, if you want a fun, cheap and cheerful little watch, it's 12 great episodes and then one real bad one that you could probably skip. So that's my recommendation on watch order.
The Sun Imps episode was the bad one, wasn't it? The last one.
It was like throwing Ewoks into the fire.
It was unfortunate that we only got a shortened 13-episode cartoon season, along with a single wave of toys, and a mere 6 issues of the comics. And to this day, we can speculate what the reasons are for the Visionaries' lack of ability to stick the landing when it came to captivating the hearts of children. And similarly, we can debate the reasons as to why Hasbro decided not to pursue the Visionaries for a second wave of toys.
I think one of the big reasons was the cost. Holograms were prohibitively expensive to make. They had more figures, and more storyline waiting in the wings, but again, if you didn't make a huge splash, if there was no big sales, they axed you. Likewise, the hologram was intended to be a huge feature of the Iron Mountain playset that was supposed to come out in Wave 2, and it would have been a giant hologram of Merklin. I don't know how that worked. I'm not sure if they knew how that worked, but it was a cool idea at the very least.
It also probably didn't help that the figures, despite being O-ring G.I. Joe style in construction, were closer to 4.5 inches tall rather than the usual 3.75 inch scale that kids were used to. So that made it a little bit of a challenge for crossover battles with your other toys. Another consideration is that it may have been difficult for children to recite some of the more complex battle commands on the playground, despite the fact that, when looking back, we as adults find the eloquent speech patterns to be very good for its time.
The arrows turn, the swords rebel. May nothing pierce this mortal shell. Sheathe these feet in the driving gale. Make swift these legs, o'er land I sail.
Additionally, for the toys, it's also noteworthy that the staffs don't fit very well into the hands of the figures, at least not usually, but they can fit if you're careful, albeit it's a little risky when trying to pry the hands open in order to do this. Ultimately, 1987 ended up as something of an experimentation year in the toy industry, and that was accentuated by the aforementioned swan song of the big three toy lines of the 1980s, at least in terms of their media. The Transformers in North America aired their final abbreviated 4th season of the cartoon, even if the toy line continued a few years after and would still see further cartoon adventures in Japanese markets. G.I. Joe aired its animated movie in this year, and although they'd have a revised series a couple years later, and the toy line would still continue, the movie did seem like an ending of sorts, without new episodes by Sunbow Animation making the airwaves. And of course, Masters of the Universe concluded entirely this year, and thus, the market was wide open for the taking, if only the Visionaries had succeeded. Of note, Hasbro tried in 1986 for their Inhumanoids series to become the next successful toy line, but that fell short, and 1 year later, Visionaries would do the same. Attention amongst children was also becoming increasingly divided, what with the continuing rise of the NES Entertainment System in the video game industry. Popular music was ever present, with the release of some of the most epic albums ever, plus some catchy tunes that would signify the glamorous nature of the 80s, not to mention other tunes that would become popular memes well into modern times. And that assumed you weren't sitting in front of the television screen with your parents, catching the latest episode of one show or another, or going down to the theater as a family for some popcorn and to see the latest great blockbuster. But the silver lining out of all this is that Visionaries does have a distinction of being part of this great 1987 year, along with all these other signature staples of pop culture, even if it only played a small part.
I feel like the legacy is really being one of the poster children for this time in the toy industry, of being something that failed quickly, was yanked just as quickly, and is something that I think as toy collectors have gotten, 2, 3, 4 He-Man lines, we've had Transformers almost consistently. It never ended. The line never ended. We're enjoying G.I. Joe. So people are really starting to dig into like what's missing. Visionaries is one that I think people kind of forget about, but once they actually like do see it, they're like, oh yeah, I like that. The holograms were cool.
Attempts many years later were made to bring the Visionaries back, such as their inclusion in a shared universe in IDW Comics, along with other Hasbro properties, as well as the 2017 San Diego Comic-Con box set that included a Leoric figure. But in hindsight, the Visionaries will probably go down as a toy line with lots of potential that was never fully realized during its initial time in the 80s. Perhaps as collectors, we can accept that as being what it's largely remembered for, and decades later, many of us do indeed still consider it as one of the more interesting toy properties, standing proudly with the other toy lines in our various collections. And if you happen to like this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm gonna put another toy history that you can click on right over here, or for a look at my personal toy collection, you can click on this video right over here. Otherwise, may the light shine forever, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.